But we are officially live. Thank you for joining us. Where are you joining us from, Celine?
I'm in Miami, Florida this evening.
Oh
How
my
about you
God,
guys?
enjoying the beach weather in the winter.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Well, we're really happy to have you with us. We have Celine Leboeuf from Miami. We have Ellie in LA. We have me in San Francisco. So
We're
this
like
is
some of the few people who aren't currently caught in a blizzard here in the US. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, well, we're enjoying the sunny weather. I don't know, at least on my end. And thank you so much to those who are joining. Welcome. And sorry, we got a couple we got started a couple of minutes late. You guys already probably apologized for that. But hey, look, we're in it. We're good. So we're learning for next lives.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be the guinea pig. No problem.
Well, we were so excited to talk to you, Celine. I think a lot of our listeners to Overthink already know that we have had you on the show before. You joined us a few years ago for an episode called Why Live, just a casual topic of to be or not to be. I really loved that episode. I have been an admirer of your work for many years. You and I have actually known each other for well over a decade at this point, right? When did we
I think
first
it's
met
just
him?
about a decade. I think it was at the
Yeah.
2016 APA, I
Yeah,
think, or was
yes.
it at STEP before?
I think it was at the APA, and you and David and I were all in the job market together, all up for some of the same jobs.
yeah, we
Yeah.
went up at the same time.
Yeah. But yeah, we have long been an admirer of your work. And part of the reason we want to talk to you today is because like we're both, I think, relatively recent to, or we're all, and when I say both, I mean like Overthink and you, but I'm also here in my capacity as like my Substack. We're all like relatively new to Substack and excited to see what it can offer for public facing philosophy. We're all really committed to public facing philosophy. And so we want to talk a little bit about that today. We also want to talk about your upcoming project. You've been working on a book on thinness. And just also as a content warning for folks joining us, we will be talking about diet culture and fat phobia. I think, that may come up in conversation. Yeah, where do you all want to start?
Well, I want to hear Celine tell us a little bit about this new project. Celine, where are you at? How far into the project are you? And what's the core of the project?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm super excited to talk about the project. So, when I was last speaking with you both, I was working on this Why Live project, maybe a second book, but I pivoted to this book that's more closely related to my work on body image in academia. And the book is called The Tyranny of Thinness, and it's done. It's going to be coming out in October. So I'm super excited about that. Happy to tell you all about like what's in the book, but more generally about the topics that got me or the trends that got me to into thinking about the topic of thinness.
Yeah, no, congratulations. That is fantastic. I think we're living in a particularly um I was going to say interesting. I think, a kind of pat way of putting it. We're living at a challenging juncture for questions of thinness and fat phobia, given the rise of GLP-1s and the fact that, there's a lot of hype around those. And at the same time, I think there's been a kind of backlash to the body positivity movement. I know you've been critical of the body positivity movement in various ways for a long time. I think, it can be just a little bit oversimplified in some of our narratives around it. But I think like now we're actually seeing not even as nuanced a discourse around that at all as we were a few years ago. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about why you think the world needs a book on thinness right now. And I'd also love to hear a little bit about how your background in phenomenology, an area of philosophy in which David and I also work, has helped you there. I know in particular you have a wonderful essay that I teach when I teach philosophy of gender on the thigh gap. And so you've been working, and it's like bringing a Beauvoirian kind of phenomenological analysis of body image and the body schema to the question of something like why a thigh gap would be desirable. So I'm seeing that already as a precursor to some of what you're working on now, but I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so the inception of the book, I guess, it's connected to my academic research, but I think for lots of authors, they start thinking about the kind of book that they would like to read, whether it's someone writing fiction or someone writing nonfiction. And I think part of the book has to do with like my own struggles with the thinness ideal for many years. Like this has gone on for decades and it's impacted my eating, things like that. And so I kind of wanted to write a book for myself, and I can say like the different
Mm,
themes within the book. But, it's not a book just for me. It would be a journal, a private journal if it was just for me. It's written in the hope that it will resonate with other readers as well. So people have also struggled with the thinness ideal and want to have, I guess, more of a deep dive than you get in some other books on body image or body positivity. So I
mhm,
have like a whole bookshelf of books on that topic. And, there's this push to body acceptance, which I'm absolutely in favor of, but they have like differing levels of analysis. Some go into the history of the thinness ideal and how it constrains us, and some of them are more like, yay, accept your body, and it's kind of doesn't go much further than that.
mm.
So this, I'm a philosophy professor, so really it is going to be a deep dive into the topic of thinness, how we got there, how it manifests today. Ellie, you mentioned the GLP-1, so that's like on the backdrop of some of my thinking. I mean, I get Google alerts about body positivity every day. I do that, just to keep on top of everything. And like 90% of my articles right now are body positivity is dead, or articles about
Mhm.
which celebrity lost a ton of weight recently. So definitely the landscape is shifting right now. And I think that's a good point to have a conversation about these norms.
Yeah, I think the shift, it's been really interesting for me to hear a lot of accusations of hypocrisy around GLP-1s, like people who have been advocates of body positivity, who have made the decision to use things like Ozempic, who then are told, oh, well, the body positivity rhetoric was just all for show because as soon as there was an opportunity to change the body, it was taken. And it's been really disheartening actually to see how popular that rhetoric has become. I'm wondering whether you can say something about the history of thinness because it is such a deeply historical concept, right? Like what counts as thin and what counts as beautiful. Have you seen um, any major changes, and what would those be? Say between the 80s when we were born, the 90s, and then the 2000s. How are you seeing thinness evolve? Because I suspect some of that will come out in the book, right? Like how the meaning of what it means to be thin and the boundary between that and non-thin is negotiated.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking more like deep history, but let me talk, in
Mhm.
our lifetimes as
Yeah.
well. So, I mean, I grew up in the 90s, early 2000s in New York and then in Paris. So the norm there was ultra skinny, as some people call it, like catwalk thin. Like you had, to look like a model on the catwalk was the ideal. And so I've seen that evolve over the years. Like right now, 2026 in Miami, it's less, that's not really the emphasis. It's more slim with curves, a kind of toned body, but still not as much body fat as someone may, naturally have. You still have to kind of slim yourself down in the right places to live up to the ideal. So I've seen like lots of fluctuations in my own life. And then there was this maybe less stringent period, I guess, at the height of body positivity with a little less pressure. I mean, I'm not saying it ever went away, but, just kind of lessening. And right now we see it's ramping up a lot.
Mhm. And in addition to the sort of beauty norms that might drive people to really set a lot of store by the thinness ideal, there have also been studies done or theories developed, actually, I think even more often theories developed, sometimes coming out of psychoanalysis or other psychological frameworks, suggesting that a desire for thinness, especially among women and girls, has a lot to do with a desire for control in circumstances in which there might not otherwise be a lot of it. And so I'm curious if you came across some of that and if you have thoughts on it as a philosopher, to what extent there might be a kind of desire for control, at least in some of these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So I draw on that idea a lot in my book. You get analyses like by Naomi Wolf, and Susan Bordeaux coming out in the
Yeah.
90s about how the thinness ideal can be read, at least in the period they're writing about, 70s, 80s, early 90s, as a backlash against the feminist liberation movements. So women had maybe equal rights or more legal rights, but they had to control their bodies because that was a way of controlling women, get them to diet and they won't protest. It kind of like a new way of limiting yourself. You limit your own body, your own food take, because you still feel constrained by gender norms to do something with yourself, to hold yourself back. So I definitely draw on those, and there's kind of a twist I circle or introduce in the book. So there was a huge rise in eating disorders during the pandemic, and that can be
Hmm.
connected because there was a sense for many people that, the pandemic was out of their control, but they could control at least their appetite, hunger, food, in that period of kind of global disorder.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting because there are the discussion of control has the two faces. There is the social control, a kind of top-down operation by which women are controlled through the promotion of this ideal of thinness, but then also the idea that one exercises control over the body when one can't control one's external circumstances, which is what I suspect Ellie was alluding to, right? And if I
Yeah.
remember, I'm pulling on very old knowledge here, so please correct me, Celine, if I'm wrong. But the Susan Bordeaux argument is largely around how young, mi- middle class white women, especially, most of whom were raised by the first generation of women who went to college in mass, um, uh, developed a lot of these eating disorders as a way precisely of doing that, of exercising control um, uh, in their lives when so much else felt like it was being controlled for them. And yeah, I want to hear a little bit more about that side because you talked about maybe the social control, and I didn't know that about the pandemic because that gets closer to this issue. Is that the right lens for thinking about thinness, or is it just one of different ways that we should be thinking about, especially eating disorders?
Yeah, so that's, I think, one lens. I think deeper into past, you can dig into narratives about the origins of fat phobia. One person that I've looked to a lot is Sabrina String's work on the connections between anti-Black racism and fat phobia. So
Fearing
it's
the
not
Black
like,
Body is one of my
stuff starts
favorite.
in the sorry, Ellie, it's not like stuff starts in the 70s and then, there's just such a deep history and changes across the globe in time.
Mhm. Yeah, sorry, I just was too excited. Yeah, I just wanted to interject and say how much I love that book. I'll link it here. But Fearing the Black Body, I mean, it's in addition to being like such a fascinating and really compelling analysis, it's written in such a way that I actually just like really enjoyed reading it. Which is kind of strange to say because it's about like very heavy topics, but basically about the racism embedded in the thinness ideal. And I see some hearts. So it looks like some folks joining us are aware of that book too.
Mhm.
Um, well, Celine, sorry, you were I am curious also. I want to let you finish that if I kind of cut you off though. Did you have anything else to say on
No, no, not at all. I mean, all I was saying is there's just like so many ways into thinking about the thinness ideal, this kind of feminist lens. Earlier, the type of work that Strings is doing about fat phobia and anti-Black racism, how those are connected. So, and there's also another maybe angle is the sociology of the modeling industry that emerged in the first half of the 20th century with the standardization of dress sizes and the perception that like taller, thinner models best showcase the material, fashion clothing. There's the normalization of clothing sizes and this emphasis um, towards a slimmer and slimmer
Mm.
ideal.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's really interesting that the idea that the body becomes essentially a tool for the display of a commodity, right? That the ideal
Yeah.
body is like a hanger that displays the
Yeah.
body for consumption. And I remember reading something a while back. I won't have the source here. Also about the rise of modeling and the opening up of modeling for especially like queer presenting men also being tied because there's been a sociological shift of, for example, thinness ideals now leading to a rise also of eating disorders in especially gay men. Whereas I think before there was this sense that it was much more gendered than it is now. And I'm curious whether that comes up in your analysis, thinness in men, and how that operates.
Yeah, I think the book is more geared towards girls and women, but I
Mhm.
certainly
Yeah.
see it all the time. Like, I you guys asked me where I'm calling in from Miami, where people are like half naked all the time, and there's this pressure to have a super buff body, shredded, what have you. And so, I mean, I see that in my day to day life, but I address it to a certain extent in my book and other and more recent academic stuff. So, yeah, there's absolutely pressure on boys and men to kind of get rid of excess body fat, quote unquote excess, to be very slim. And I think that, or slim and toned. And I think that there's more research being done these days, especially in psychology, to highlight these evolutions, especially looking at queer men communities, those communities that face especially high rises in eating disorders and body image issues.
Mm.
Great. Thanks so much for this. I really look forward to reading your work on this. And I think in general, it's super exciting to have another wonderful book of public facing philosophy be on the horizon. I think we're in such a golden age of books, the philosophical books that are written for the public. And so I think this will be so valuable. Speaking of sort of public facing philosophy, I want to pivot a little bit to a conversation between the three of us about what it means to sort of do philosophy outside of academia. I think this is of interest to a lot of folks joining the Substack. And also to what extent we can sort of apply philosophy, because I know I had a video recently on how I feel like the question, how do you apply philosophy to your daily life, is not the right one to ask. And I think to some extent, Céline, you agree with me, but you also indicated there's a little bit of disagreement. So maybe for those who haven't seen this video, I'll just say briefly, if I remember, because I just like recorded this a couple weeks ago and then that was that. But it's something about the way that, like, I think when we think about applying philosophy to our daily life, we're usually thinking about it as some sort of body of knowledge that exists above and beyond daily life, and from which we can sort of pick. And I think that conception of philosophy, it sort of overlooks the way that philosophy is actually imbued in our everyday existence and comes out of it. And so I think there's like a much more dialectical and interwoven relationship between what we consider philosophy and what we consider life than the question of applying it might convey. And I think this also points to sort of questions of the difference between theory and praxis, which we might want to get into, all sorts of stuff. But to start off, Selena, why do you think I should hold on to the idea that we should apply philosophy to our daily life? Why isn't the question a bad one?
Uh, I mean, there are kind of two angles into the question. I mean, one of it is my pet like ideas that, I learned about as an undergrad, philosophy as a way of life that you get from a bunch of thinkers, but in particular Pierre Hadot. And Hadot was emphasizing that in the ancient schools, um, philosophers thought of their task as not just theory. They had to live by whatever philosophy they crafted. So I'm still attracted to that idea. And I think that whether you're a Stoic I mean, Stoicism is still super popular. I can never get people to get into Epicureanism in my, in
Wait,
my
it's so funny you
philosophy
say this.
class. I
We
can't.
have an upcoming episode on Epicurus where we articulate precisely that. We're like, why is everybody obsessed with Stoicism? Nobody's talking about Epicurus. So okay, we're on the same page.
Oh my God, yeah. We have to convert all the intro students, at least those at my university. Epicurus is worth considering, worth
Uh,
trying to emulate in a way.
yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I've been inspired by that idea, also inspired by the idea of, you know, the personal as a political in feminism. And so I think feminist philosophy is personal and also political in a way. So, it's not just returning to Stoicism, it's also trying to take these more recent theories and seeing how they can shape our lives.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, in connection to this, something that has been influential for me for a long time is Gramsci's argument that every person is an intellectual, right? Every individual, independently of their career or how they spend their time, has a worldview that expresses their values, that reflects their position in the world. And so I'm sort of somewhere in between the two of you, where I do think that there is room for thinking about the quote unquote application of philosophy to everyday life, because philosophy does give us tools, right, in the form of theories and concepts that you can use to change or to reflect upon how you go about life. And so in that sense, there's an application. But at the same time, we all live a philosophy through our actions and our behaviors. And so I want to resist, like Ellie, the idea that philosophy is something that is found under the P shelf in the library, where all the philosophy books are. And yeah, I'm always torn though about the role of public philosophy in the present, largely because it is walking a really thin line, and that requires some negotiations that are, it's not, for which there is not always a clear answer. And I suspect maybe you felt a version of this, and I want to hear your thoughts about this. Like, what platform should I use? Different platforms have different limits for doing public philosophy. Which platform should I use? How much of my labor should go toward building an audience rather than just putting content out there? How do I divide my responsibilities as a public philosopher between like my desire to have an audience, and then like my desire to make sure that I do so in a way that's still rigorous? So I'm just curious about what challenges you faced and how you would describe them in this new space of public philosophy that is very closely connected to social media, to places like Substack or Patreon. Like it's an interesting space.
Yeah, maybe I can link that up to our, just applying philosophy to life, whether it's in a space like Substack or another, or just a philosophy classroom.
Mhm.
But one thing that I've been seeing recently, like on Substack this weekend or end of last week, was this emphasis on like friction, philosophy or like academic stuff, introducing friction into people's lives so that they're not, just gliding along, doing leading their life in a kind of automatic fashion,
Mm.
kind of challenging their habits or their decisions, what have you. And I think that that's something that I've seen both as a student. I mentioned when we were like exchanging emails before that I was influenced as an undergrad to become a vegetarian at the time because I like read philosophy. And so that introduced friction into like my meat eating habits in life and made me question. So it may not be like a theory that you can download living in the philosophy sphere and then you apply it to your life. But I think that's a fruitful idea for thinking about how philosophy, whether it's in your classroom or on a space like Substack or Patreon or something, how that can interrupt things.
Totally. Yeah, I'm really glad you bring that in. And I think there's two directions I want to go in based on that point about friction. One is so your example of vegetarianism just now made me think that whether or not we all agree that the question, how can you apply philosophy to your life, or how do you apply philosophy to your life, is a good one. I think for me, the term apply is what like kind of gives me the ick, I would say. We can agree that the question, how does studying philosophy change your life, is an important one. And so I would like to maybe hear each of us share a little bit about what our views are on that. I would also love if folks want to type in their answers to that. Like, how has studying philosophy changed your life? And then I want to go in a different direction, which has to do with friction and what we can't outsource to AI, because I think that's something that you hear a lot about today. And I know you had mentioned before we started this live that that's something you were interested in thinking about too. And I totally want to go there. So maybe for starters, so one of the ways that philosophy changed your life, Céline, was by leading you to become a vegetarian.
Yeah, I've defected since, but at the time, yes.
Yeah. And was it philosophy that changed you was it philosophy that made you defect as well, or no?
No, different influence maybe for a separate
Okay.
conversation, but
Okay.
what was interesting was, it was both the philosophy, but also having the conversation with the philosopher who most influenced me at the time, who was Christine Korsgaard. Like, I got to study with her, and so it's not just a philosophy that I read about, but it's a philosophy that was, like, literally in front of me. I invited her to faculty dinner as an undergrad, and I was like, "Oh my god, there's a vegetarian who's also explaining why they're a vegetarian and tying it to various theories." And so, Kurzgaard's example was hugely influential for me. So that's one example. There are been other ways, either feminist philosophy or I teach philosophy of death. I've taught it many times now. I think we're going on 6 this summer. How that has shaped my relationship to my mortality. I think I had like huge death anxiety just across my life, but now I've talked about death for so many hours that it has a bit of a maybe a Montaigne style, like I've become accustomed to it. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe once things feel more real, I'll like default, but I think the teaching philosophy of death has shaped my life.
Okay, okay. Yeah, and I think, also I'm in my Christine Korsgaard era now. You had your Christine Korsgaard era earlier. I'm in mine now. I'm loving her work lately. I think for me, the biggest way, I mean, obviously, I think each of us could say a gazillion ways that philosophy has changed our lives, and probably many more ways that we can't articulate, but that, it nonetheless has changed us, with respect to. I think for me, the most obvious example comes up. Now I just lost all my words. Sorry. The most obvious example that comes up is non-monogamous relationships. That was first, it was through, and I think in both of our cases, it's like a mix of a personal example, but then also reading. I became curious about non-monogamous relationships through reading Simone de Beauvoir, who's not, in every respect a wonderful example, but who nonetheless really wanted to do something different with her relationships, which was to question the norm of heterosexual monogamous marriage. And then I think, once David and I got to grad school, I met like the first people that I'd ever met who were in non-monogamous relationships, and then saw sort of how they were really resisting accepted norms around what a relationship looks like. And then through reading other stuff, there's a text that I teach in the intimate relationships class, which I'm also offering a video version of now on Substack, asking whether monogamy is morally permissible, and answering no, and
Hmm.
using a very well-known comparison in philosophy of love, which is, well, you wouldn't stop a friend from having friendships with other people. What about romantic love and or sex is different, where we do accept that being in a relationship of that sort generally means that you can't have other relationships of that sort. And so that kind of logical reasoning through it has really impacted me as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of which example to choose about this because you're right. We became philosophers, the three of us, and so we've been dealing with these changes for a long time. And sometimes they're really hard to spot. You just read stuff, you move on with your life, and then you look backwards and you realize, oh, I've changed, and I'm only now realizing to what a degree. But the example that I'll use actually has to do with overthink. I am not a specialist in moral psychology or in moral theory. And as part of
Oh,
our
I
work
know
with
where you're going with this one.
well, as part of Overthink, we've done a number of episodes
Yeah,
on
but I know which
moral
one you're talking
emotions.
about.
Well, maybe, yeah. But I'm gonna say the whole class of episodes that we've done on moral emotions, like envy, like regret.
That's the one I thought you were going for. Regret.
Yeah. It's not that it's changed my way of experiencing the emotions themselves although perhaps that's also true. But it really has changed how I go about clarifying what I wish my relationship to those emotions and emotional states to be. Like, how do I want to relate to envy? Do I need to think more about the extent to which I am an envious subject, even though I didn't think I was? Or my view on regret changed in the course of doing the episode on regret, which is why Ellie thought I was going this way. I really thought before that regret was useless, and then we did this episode, and now sometimes I spend time thinking about the things that I regret, not out of morbidity, but because I do see it as a kind of moral reflection on missed opportunities. And I think that has a lot of value. And so I do share this sense that the question of what philosophy can do to lick us into new shapes is really important, because otherwise philosophy would have no justification, right? If it doesn't change us in some way, arguably for the better, or at least if it doesn't have that power, then it would have a very difficult time justifying its existence as a discipline.
Mhm. Shall we talk then about how this applies to something like the age of LLMs? Because I think part of what you're getting at right now, David, is the fact that philosophy, um, it's not an existing body of knowledge that you can just basically download through asking an LLM something and, then having it like generate an answer for you. And I just love to hear you both think a little bit more about that, and in what sense that kind of friction, how does philosophy generate and sustain friction, and how does that relate to its mission as being something that we can't outsource through LLMs?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot just in the last few days because I do a unit in my Intro to Philosophy course on education. And we had a closing discussion. I often do it around the actual thinkers that we've studied, but I just thought, we're just going to have an open conversation about how people are using AI these days, whether it's in their daily lives, like structuring their workouts or creating schedules for their work and education, like their college life, or actually in academic settings. So I learned that roughly 85% seems of my intro students were putting the readings in an LLM like ChatGPT to do them, quote unquote. So, that makes me rethink what's the purpose of my reading? What are we doing as educators in philosophy? And tomorrow we're doing some Aristotle and we're going to have some close reading in class. So at least we'll do a little friction there in terms of at least pushing people into developing that reading skill for as long as we can cultivate that in this, era.
Yeah.
What I think the term friction really is central here, because something that I have underscored basically every time we've talked about LLMs in Overthink, is that LLMs are technologies that are proprietary and whose function it is to increase user engagement in order for them to turn a profit. And so, by definition, what they will not do is produce friction, or tension in the consumer, because that doesn't sell, right? If I don't know, if my LLM starts telling me, David, you're not reflecting enough, you're not doing your work well enough, you're being lazy, I'm not gonna be chatting with ChatGPT. And so I think that's what's missing from LLMs. It's the capacity to produce friction in the user, genuine friction, the kind that leads to psychological growth and spiritual change, if we want to use that term. Maybe spiritual is not the right term, unless here we use it in a very broad sense. And also, we often talk about philosophy as the discipline of questioning, right? Like it's where we question things. And LLMs don't do that. They don't question the user. They only answer the user's questions. And it lacks a truly dialogical character. And you need that back and forth in order to generate enough momentum for that growth. At best, you can tell ChatGPT, give me a list of questions that I should be thinking about. And then it gives it to you. But in that case, they're not genuine questions. They're a response to your question. So you're never in question when you use these LLMs.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that. Just like an anecdote, so I do pop quizzes in many of my philosophy classes. And one of the elements of the pop quiz is an open-ended, what did you find interesting, perplexing, or controversial in the readings? And so it's like open-ended. People can say whatever they want about what they found that annoyed them or whatever. And I found in the last year that I get very stock, like rote responses, everyone writing the same thing that they found interesting, perplexing, or controversial. Because I think they're just asking ChatGPT, what was interesting in Nicomachean Ethics, like book 8 on friendship? They all love the 3 types of friendships. Guess what? Well, I would want to know, like, what did you actually find controversial? And I'm getting less of that, at least in my introductory courses.
Mm.
And Céline, you mentioned 85% of your students, I think you said last year, were using ChatGPT or other LLMs to like summarize the reading. Do you have information about why that was?
So, yeah, this was not last year, like last Thursday, actually. So we
Oh,
had this
sorry, last week. Okay.
open-ended. Yeah, no, that's fine. We had the open-ended question just last week. And I think it's the general thing the sense I got is people want to be as efficient as possible as they juggle 5 classes at my university, jobs, and things like that. And so it's not like they don't want to learn about philosophy necessarily, but they think that the most efficient way, given the competing demands on their time, and sometimes the difficulty of the text, is to run it through ChatGPT.
Mm.
Okay. Yeah, because that signals to me that they're treating this as a body of knowledge. Like, for instance, I mean, one of the many things you would lose there, and there's so many things you would lose there, but you lose the narrative voice in which the author is writing. And so that signals to me that they're not thinking that's important for philosophy. It is something that I think is important. Lots of philosophers, terrible writers, but I still want to read what they wrote. But I think, something that David and I have talked about, even as most recently as our last Substack Live for our Overthink paid subscribers a week ago, is my concerns at a professor at a small elite liberal arts college that there's going to be an increasing stratification of literacy where so in my classes are capped at 22 and they're often smaller than that. And for that reason, I can do more things like integrate oral exams for my students, but also with reading. My students tend to come to college with a better background of education than students at the majority of state schools. And there are obviously like the reasons for that mainly have to do with inequities. But I think largely what's likely happening in those cases too is in addition to efficiency, there's the question of, just lack of comprehension, which you mentioned. Philosophy is really, really hard to read. Even like I got a 5 on both of my AP English exams when I was in high school. And when I got to college and had to read Plato for the first time, I was completely at sea. I had no idea what was going on. And Plato's not even one of the hardest philosophers. So I do think there's a really steep learning curve for most people who are educated in America when it comes to reading philosophy. I'd be curious also, Céline, if you have thoughts on how, that's obviously very different from France. And I know you mentioned you grew up splitting your time between New York and Paris. And so I think a lot of times like students just don't have sort of the preparation to be able to successfully achieve or close the gap, let's actually say, close the gap between their current reading knowledge and the reading knowledge required in order to understand Plato, let alone Kant or Hegel. And that learning curve was steep for me, but, I did it. And now I can read those people and actually often with pleasure.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Maybe David, you want to weigh in? I'm still pondering.
Yeah, and
Okay.
maybe I'll just kind of close out that line of thinking.
Yeah.
Just say like one little final, bow to wrap that in is that I think the reason that I could close that gap and achieve that learning curve is because I had a sort of baseline of high school education that was helpful, for me getting there. And then I also had like professors at a smaller liberal arts college where I was taught who could help me get there. And so I think it's not a moralizing point at all. I think actually what's
Mhm.
really sad to me is the way that so many people who don't have that kind of background then end up having to reach for LLMs when they would want to read Plato or Kant or Hegel, but just don't know how and don't have the resources to sort of figure that out. There's a lot of autodidacticism obviously going on social media, which I think like can be really beautiful, but I think
Mhm.
is only kind of a band-aid for the inequities that we have in our educational system.
No, I think that's right. Well, what I'll say here is that I think there's also a suspicion that a lot of people have, and I read this as part of a larger kind of anti-intellectual sentiment that sometimes gets its fires fanned by different political actors. And the idea being that that kind of difficult writing that you're talking about, Ellie, that dense, almost inaccessible at first type of writing is just gatekeeping, that people write like that intentionally to exclude others. And I think that's a really problematic view because I do believe that different forms of writing can produce different thoughts in the mind of the reader, right? Like reading a really complex sentence with very precise terms allows you to have a complex thought with precise ideas. In the same way that, sometimes reading very short sentences that just like hit an idea on the head gives you a similar kind of reading experience. And so that's something that I've had to battle with some of my students at my state university who sometimes are like, why do we have to read Plato or Kant or Freud? Why can't I just read the listicle that explains it and waters it down? And I think the idea there is that you can compress or like depress, I guess, the writing, and that you don't lose anything of value. And so I often have to have a talk with my students about the value of hitting your head against a book and then the pleasure that happens when the book opens up for you. But it does require that steep kind of like climb. And the learning curve can be, a little bit steep or maybe a little flatter, depending on your starting point. But I at least was much more like my own students when I came into philosophy. I had never read a book until high school. I didn't grow up with a reading culture in my household. And I went to public school in Mexico. I went to public school in the US. I went to a state school, to a state university in the US with limited resources. And I did find myself fighting to overcome that gap that Ellie's talking about in grad school. And so I felt it myself where I was like, am I not smart enough to read some of these things that I think some of my peers are not struggling with as much? In my case, that was also compounded by being ESL, where I was like, is it me or is it the language? I don't know.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind on this topic is not so much about philosophy, but more about, the complexity of thinking or responding to text. So, um, when I was in junior high and high school in France, I took Latin, which is not something that many people do anymore, but I had 7 years of it and a little of it in college. And I think people at the time were like, "Oh, learning Latin is super useful for like etymology. If you're a lawyer or a doctor, you'll know the roots of words." And I do know a lot of roots of words, but right now I could Google it in just as much time and find out the root of a word. And if I didn't study the language, then yeah, I'd have it in just as short amount of time. But I think there's still some value in the Latin insofar as like I had to bang my head against the books, the very complex sentences, and memorize and learn the vocabulary and learn to structure sentences, like how they worked very differently from English or French or German, whatever. So I saw some value, or I still see some value in what I did, but maybe not the same value that my teachers at the time had in mind for the education I received.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I impressed to my students last week, the first class session of the semester, is the fact that because for most of them, this isn't the case at all schools, but it's certainly the case where I teach. For most of them, being a student is their full-time job. And that means that the skills that they learn as students are the basis of their professional skills thereafter. And so if the skills that they're developing are continually being outsourced or they're not being developed because they're being outsourced, then they're not just depriving themselves of a liberal arts education, they're also depriving themselves of like core professional and life skills. And so that, I think, when we just look at how much time students are spending on school, it's like, yeah, that's a lot of their life when they're young people. And so how are they then they're going to bring that same kind of approach, I think, to many other pursuits. I want to remind our audience that we are very happy to answer questions. We've got, some more minutes here before we close. If anybody does have questions or thoughts that you want us to consider, in the meantime, if folks are jotting stuff down, Céline, you said you wanted to share a couple of ideas for Overthink episodes with us, right?
Yeah, yeah. I've been, I go through podcast phases and I'm deep in podcasts, Overthink, lots of others. But, I don't know. There are times where I'm just like, I'm going to listen to music. And then I go through months where I'm mostly listening to podcasts, especially when I'm doing stuff. But, anyways, one of the ideas that came to mind is abstinence. So I've been thinking about that. In different contexts, there's women who want to abstain from sexual or romantic relationships, with men in certain political contexts, or geographical contexts. That's happened recently here. Abstinence, people like going against, not drinking as much alcohol. And obviously when, in my research on the thinness ideal, people abstaining or reducing food or types of food. So just think there's a lot of room to think about abstinence. And there's a whole philosophical tradition of thinking about that topic as well. So I think it would be a cool episode.
Any philosophers you'd recommend? I'm just writing this down for our purposes. I also just saw Testament of Anne Lee, the film about the Shaker, famous Shaker leader, and she was very into chastity, because chastity, obviously, like abstinence, chastity, some overlap there, but abstinence would be a little bit broader, which might be nice because we can talk about sexual chastity or celibacy as well as other things.
Yeah, and there's also not just in resisting, like heterosexual relationships, but also just like chastity is also having in general, I think, a moment in our culture. As far as philosophy, I mean, I think of ancient philosophers, but also Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals, the third essay.
The aesthetic ideal.
On asceticism, yeah.
There would be stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, also the religious use of abstinence, and abstinence for religious reasons like fasting. There's some really interesting stuff historically. I recently read a book about how some birds, for example, were classified by popes who really liked eating them as not animals, so that they just like bypassed like they're technically not animals according to religious authorities. Yeah, like but the interesting point here is that I think we often respond to our own pledges of abstinence by doing really careful hair splitting. It's like the purity culture where it's like, oh well, anal sex doesn't count, and I maintain purity. Or think about the Mormon practice, like the college students doing soaking, where it's like, if I'm not moving my body, it doesn't count as sex because it's technically not my volition that initiates it. So I find that philosophically very interesting. Like
I spent a summer after I graduated college, before I went to grad school, living in an ashram in rural Canada. And one of the principles that we had to live by was sexual abstinence, including no masturbation. And the idea there, because it's a Hindu framework rooted in some ideas that come out of Shivananda's ashram in Rishikesh. Long story, don't have to go into it. But the idea there is that the goal is to awaken Kundalini energy, and there's a sort of dispersal of that if you have sex. And so, I mean, I have a lot to say about that, in part because it was like sort of comical, but it was just like all these young hot hippies who like couldn't hook up.
There's a scene in Sex and the City, in like the original show, where like Samantha, like I think encounters a guy who's like into abstinence and eroticizes it.
No, it's the priest, right? Is it the same guy or no?
I don't know if it's a priest.
Maybe it's a different guy.
Yeah,
okay.
Because
there's one where she hooks up with a priest too.
I'm sure.
Okay, I'm not seeing questions. Anyone have
Yeah, no,
Any
I
questions
haven't seen
about
anything.
this?
No, but Celine, you said that was one topic, and then you had another one other than
The
abstinence.
Yeah, the other one was androgyny because I listened to the
Oh,
femininity and masculinity episodes, and that's also like a philosophically rich topic. It's come up, recently, especially with attention to symposium.
yes. Uh,
Yeah, actually, you know what? Maybe we could talk. So I appreciate that.
mhm.
Let me think about that. Because I feel like that, yeah, that would be helpful and interesting to think about. Anyway, maybe we can talk a little bit about that because I don't think we've actually really commented on that. Some people may know that at Texas A&M a few weeks ago, a professor was banned from teaching Plato's symposium because of its gender ideology. So teaching Plato literally goes against the current laws in Texas around gender ideology. And I think this particularly was scary and highly alarming for me because I have presented at Texas A&M. I think David and Céline, like at least our professional organization, SPEP was hosted by Texas A&M a few years ago. I mean, there was a lot of what would now be considered gender ideology going on there, and that was pre-reelection of Trump. But I think it hit particularly close to home since this is a space where I do know actually a lot of professors there. I haven't heard anything from the inside. I really want to ask, but I've felt sort of like hesitant to. But yeah, I'm curious on what you all think about this censorship of a text by Plato at a leading university in the US under Trump.
Uh, I mean, well, I'm not for it. I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
No,
I
what's
mean, I feel really
interesting.
lucky not to be having to deal with this as somebody who's living in California, knock on wood, but
Yeah, no, I remember seeing the language specifically that was used, and the emails back and forth between the administration and the faculty member. And I think what was really scary for me is just seeing the impersonal nature and the presentation of the ban as such a neutral maneuver on the part of the university, right? Shifting the burden actually onto the professor. I think it was something like, you can't use these sections of Plato without like justifying them in some way as if philosophical texts are by default suspect and can only be presented to students after they have been like vetted by those in power. And so that's really troublesome to me. And in some ways I also want to say that it's giving philosophy, like, I'm sorry, I love Plato, but it's not that radical, of
yeah.
all the things that could be presented in that way. And so the fact that Plato, is the one that received the censorship for me, s I don't wanna be, pessimistic, but it made me feel like if Plato is not safe to teach, then I don't know what is. Of all the thinkers in the history of the canon, um, why Plato?
Yeah, I mean, I have a thought on that. I want to ask, yeah, Celine, give you a second to respond if you want to before that.
Yeah, I think it's hit philosophers, at least in the academy, or surprised us because we think, as David was saying, that Plato is not controversial or out there or anything. So I think that's, it's not teaching contemporary like feminist or queer philosophy. So all of a sudden that some of like our one of our founding figures in the work West gets censored is troubling. And I think it's troubling for a lot of people, including myself. Yeah, I don't know. Did you want to add anything, Ellie?
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking, so I mean, one thing that a lot of people have remarked upon is the, I don't know if irony is the right word here, but perhaps of the fact that the one of the primary interlocutors in Plato's Symposium is Socrates, who was literally sentenced to death for corrupting the youth. And so there's this kind of repetition of history where philosophy in the time of Socrates was seen as a corrupting force. And then now again, we're seeing it resurge as a corrupting force, which I think, speaks to the fact that philosophy isn't just some sort of benign ivory tower discipline, although maybe not in the way that we would like it to. But I think also in terms of your question, David, like
Mhm.
if Plato's not safe, then who is? I don't know. I might reframe that slightly because I actually think a lot of the ideas articulated in the symposium are highly subversive from a contemporary standpoint of love and gender. And that's actually one of my favorite parts about teaching that text. And so that text is included in the intimate relationships class that I teach at Pomona and also have a version of on Substack. And it is continually a source of delight for me when students realize that Plato's Symposium, this canonical text about the philosophy of love written well over 2,000 years ago, talks about queer relationships. And so
Mhm.
for those who may not have read the text, the gender ideology that's being referred to in this ban is the fact that in Aristophanes' speech, there's a few things, but it's really mainly around Aristophanes' speech. In Aristophanes' speech, the famous playwright, the comedian of the time, articulates a myth where there originally were sort of these people who were two people rather than just one, and we were each and then we got split apart by Zeus, and then we're trying to find our other half, and that's what love is. And those two, the kind of people, these wholes, were male male, female female, and or female male. And so it basically articulates a justification not only of heterosexual love but also of homosexual love. And so that, I think, when students read that, they're like, oh wow, this is so interesting. We
Mm.
didn't know that there was like an attention to homosexuality in ancient Greece. And I'm like, well, yeah, you must not know very much about ancient Greece then. And there's a hell of a lot more to say about that, some of which is pretty problematic too. But I think like that discovery of a part of history right in the heart of the canon that is subversive is really compelling for students. And it's amazing to watch, and it can really help shape their understanding.
Mhm. No, thanks for saying that, Ellie. I think you've convinced me that the way I framed it maybe is not the most helpful. And nonetheless, I think I still wonder whether there are limits to what this censorship could impose. But Celine, go ahead. And then I have to know we're almost at time.
Yeah. And we did get a question for Celine, but the person said that they joined somewhat late. And so luckily, actually, the question they asked is what we spent the first 15 or so minutes talking about. So
Okay,
please
okay.
go back and, yeah, take a look at that.
Yeah, I won't circle back to Beauvoir, but yeah, I think it's just I think many of us in the academy, like come with David's mindset about, wow, it's Plato. I can't come to it that way as well. So I like the way that you've allowed us to look into the symposium and see what could be read as subversive.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Celine, thank you so much for joining us for our guinea pig exercise in a three-way Substack Live. We are really happy with the turnout. We had over 70 people listening to us. We hope that this conversation has been helpful to all of you. And of course, follow Celine's work, which is really great and exciting. And as usual, support your favorite philosophy podcast if you feel so inclined. We love doing this work, and we, in particular, enjoy making sure that we exist at this in between, in between space between um, academia and the general public.
Awesome. Yeah, great to
Awesome.
see so
Yeah,
many
thank you.
faces. Okay,
All
thanks
right.
Great to
all.
chat. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks, Lee.